Jimmy Nettle of Nightfire. Jimmy Nettle Nightfire, that's a second life name for you. Politicians can't do it. We have to take action ourselves. Well, Greenpeace presumably would go along with that.
I think there are actions that we can all take as individuals that will help solve this problem. I think, having said that, the fact is that if we're going to make progress, we need governments to solve this problem. I think there's only so much we can do, unless we're willing to go so far as to, individually shut coal plants down. I mean, I think, we need to put policies in place that encourage the right behavior, that discourage the wrong behavior, and that, incentivize the right kinds of technologies that are going to get us where we need to go. So I think it's important that we all take responsibility for what we can do. Having said that, I think after we've changed the light bulbs in our home, after we've bought more fuel-efficient cars, I think, we really need to focus our attention on our elected leaders and, frankly, light a fire under their butt, because we're well behind in the U.S.
That's answered one of the questions I was going to put to you, actually, that came after the program closed the other day, when we were talking to, I can't remember now, it might have been someone from Asia or Africa, I can't remember who said it, but a question came in to say, well, what can we in the West do to help tackle the problem, apart from government? Obviously, government action would be terrific. So you've mentioned a couple of things like light bulbs, but do you have some other hints? People everywhere seem to be saying, what can we do? What can we do? This problem's so big. You feel kind of isolated and disempowered.
I mean, things like light bulbs, things like, driving more fuel-efficient cars sound small, but they really are at the heart of, how we can help tackle this problem. I mean, there are, choices we can make about where we take our vacations. Do you fly to a place like Bali, or, do you vacation more closely to your home? I mean, I think these kinds of decisions are things that we all ought to be thinking about, but, it is really important that we all focus on our policymakers. I mean, we live in a democracy. Voter turnout in our country is pathetically low when compared to other countries. We really need to take responsibility both for the actions in our own life, but then also be better citizens, because I think that's the only way we're going to see the kind of progress, the levels of reductions that are going to get us to where we need to go.
You've mentioned holidays, and I wonder if I could ask you, Michael Dorsey, what one of the issues is, especially for developing countries, especially if they're pretty dependent on tourism, they're in a bit of a dilemma because the flights are serious emitters of carbon and nobody seems to want to touch them, but presumably sooner or later they'll be brought into some of these agreements. But if the flights are curtailed, some countries will be hit very hard because there are fewer tourists. So what do? Do any of your members have an attitude about this, or is it something that is discussed?
Well, I think, there's definitely a dilemma with respect to tourism outright, but I think what we really need to think about when we think about the way in which developing countries are going to be affected by this crisis is one, focusing our energy to have the rich countries that have driven the climate crisis commit to first putting real resources up for adaptation and mitigation, because if you know the science and if you believe the science and you respect the science that's coming out of places like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and really great places around the world that are helping put together the science, you know that the problem is actually going to be much worse than we really having a conversation on. So we're going to really need real significant resources on adaptation and mitigation. The second thing is that the developed countries have got to recommit themselves to fulfilling the development agenda that they began to make the case for in cooperation with developing countries, those poorer countries in the South, or the global South as it were, that they began to put together in the early 70s and through the 80s. They've got to recommit themselves to meeting the minimum requirements for development and development aid. And also, part of that means eliminating the debt, particularly for highly indebted poor countries and countries that are facing debt crisis. The first step to really moving real resources is tackling that problem and dealing with that seriously. And then we don't have to worry about sort of, I won't call it window dressing, but smaller concerns about tourism, because committing to tackling the debt and also dealing with development assistance, those resources dwarf what would be lost in terms of tourism revenues slumping because of dealing with air traffic.
Okay, that leads into this one. There has no question mark on this one, but maybe one of you could take it as a question. Flanu Dork's phone, I think, comment. There seems to be no awareness in the US to drastically cut down on flying. Is that true, or is it still? Do you think that's something that has yet to come? That people are perhaps conscious of fuel emissions, but not cars, but not flying yet.
I think that's probably not an inaccurate statement. I mean, I think what we do know, and as Representative Markey said in his piece, that the American public is increasingly aware of this problem and want action on it. So I think that's the level at which we can begin to tackle things like international air travel, So I think you're probably right that most Americans don't understand necessarily the impact of flying. Having said that, I think most Americans are beginning to understand this issue, and I think increasingly are looking to elected leaders to really take a position on it.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the negotiations, but we've got a couple of questions, and thanks for the questions are now flooding in here. Beatrix Benoit of London. Is the public in the US or Europe coming round to the idea of reduced consumption? This presumably is the big one here, isn't it? Consumption is what's caused this problem, and if it goes on, not just in the West, but all over the place, it's just going to presumably get worse unless we have a very carbon-free technology. Do you think the public in your US or Europe, if you know it, coming round a little more to consumption, or we're just at the beginning of that road? I want to say something on that.
Sure, and this may be my last question because I have to go off and talk to some carbon traders that are, pushing the consumption of market mechanisms and this sort of thing. But I think in general in the United States, there's definitely awareness that reducing consumption is a critical part of the solution of tackling, climate change and trying to work towards averting climate catastrophe. I think it's perhaps a little bit more so in Europe, in part because of the pricing of goods and the effort to incorporate environmental costs into a lot of goods. The discussions here, particularly in terms of talking about the emerging carbon markets, I've heard some really interesting conversations from steel manufacturers, for example, where they say, well, look, we have a competitiveness crisis between, within the EU space where we have to incorporate the cost of carbon into the production of steel, whereas competitors that aren't operating underneath the European Union emissions trading scheme don't have to include those costs. So there's clearly some places, like in the European Union space, where the costs aren't being figured in to deal with things like greenhouse gases, and other places where they not yet there, but still citizens are thinking about those things.
Okay, I was going to ask you what you wanted out of the conference, but you've got your reason to go in. But I think I have to ask you this one, because the caller, who's Anuradha in Sri Lanka, has actually written at the end, tell Michael he can go if he needs to. So I think anyone as kind and considerate as that has got to have her question answered, which was, so overall, do you still have hope that we will actually save the planet?
Absolutely. I mean, the real focus, I think, is with citizens and with peoples movements and with social movements. And these movements are always delivering the fight to corrupt, bankrupt industries as well as politicians, and they're going to keep putting the feet to the fire of those individuals that aren't delivering solutions here, and continue to work for solutions. And there's a tremendous amount, I think, of resilience in communities around the world that are going to keep working for solutions and keep pushing. So I think that really the solutions are there, but the time it'll take will be, it'll be the space that we need to have those sort of breakthroughs that'll really push us forward. But I think there's a tremendous amount of possibility for change. So I'm optimistic.
Great. Accentuate the positive. Thanks very much, Michael Dorsey. You've earned you can slip away to go and nobble them. As Professor of Global Environmental Policy at Dartmouth College, New Hampshire, and for something called the Durban Group, which we haven't fully explained, but you can look it up.